Let's keep reading McGruer and the Goat. We're up to page 16. Now I must get busy, she said. Come back at midday and have dinner with me. McGruer was a tidy octopus, so he spent the morning rounding up the cheeses and stacking them neatly in the basket, while Captain Duff washed the plum brandy glasses and chuckled over the stories Mrs. Dumpling had told. As for Mrs. Dumpling, she sang every song she knew while she made the biggest apple dumpling in all Otago and put it to cook in her largest pot. She stoked the fire so well, the water boiled so hard, and the dumpling swelled so large that just before midday it swelled right out of the pot and up into the chimney. When Captain Duff and McGruer arrived for dinner, smoke was pouring out of the door of Mrs. Dumpling's house, and tears were rolling down her cheeks. "There's always tomorrow," Captain Duff said, "and McGruer will clean out your chimney in no time when it cools." "But Mr. McGruer is my guest of honour at dinner today, and now I can only give him bread and cheese." She wiped away her tears. "Never mind, there's nothing better than goat's milk cheese." "Not goat's milk cheese," Captain Duff said. "Any other kind, but not goat's milk. McGruer is allergic to goat's milk cheese." He winked at McGruer. "No one is allergic to goat's milk," Mrs. Dumpling declared. "And this is the finest goat's milk cheese in Otago." "Octopuses are super sensitive," Captain Duff said. "Besides, he doesn't like it. McGruer is used to dugong cheese, and McElliot is an acquired taste." "Dugong cheese?" Mrs. Dumpling was flustered. "I'm afraid I haven't got any of that. I know then. Strawberry jam. I know he likes strawberries. I know he doesn't. Snails he likes, not strawberries. Strawberries make him sick." The thought of an octopus being sick in her kitchen was almost too much for Mrs. Dumpling, but the thought of serving snails on one of her best blue and white china plates was also hard to swallow. "I know you were telling me how people eat snails in France, but I thought you said he came from the South Seas. So what does he eat when he's at home? I mean, at home there, not at home here," she inquired, anxious for her reputation as a hostess. "Crabs for preference," Captain Duff said. "Now you're talking," Mrs. Dumpling said. "I have the very thing. Crabs picked after my grandmother's recipe." She put down a big crock in front of McGruer. McGruer lifted the lid and pulled out a pickled crab-apple. He gurgled as he swallowed it and rolled his eyes at Captain Duff. But it was kindly meant, for after all, what did she know of tropical islands and crabs which scuttled sideways under rocks instead of hanging by stalks on trees? They settled down to celebrate the saving of the roof, and the kitchen was soon filled with the sayings and doings of folk of the olden days, the air bright with images of faraway places. Captain Duff was just putting away the last slice of bread and cheese. McGruer had already licked out the last drops of Grandmother Dumpling's secret syrup and was looking around. There were shelves stacked with cheeses, jars of apple jelly, and enough knitted socks and gloves to have fitted him eight times over. Mrs. Dumpling, who had already picked up her knitting, saw his wandering gaze and sighed. "McElliot and I used to go to market once a week. I'd fill my cart with socks and cheeses and apple pies, and McElliot pulled it for me. I did such a good trade," she sighed again. But McElliot started to get a wee bit bored with being in the town. She ate the town clerk's roses, chased the schoolmaster up the street, climbed on the church roof and rang the bell. She loved the library and especially liked the encyclopedias. She rode on the fire engine and hitchhiked on top of a bus. But it was the day she danced on the bar in the hotel that did it. She just refused to pull the cart after that. "And even though the cart was light, I always used to sell everything. People would queue up for my apple pies," Mrs. Dumpling said proudly. "It's a long haul home up those hills, so I had to stop going to market." "But I couldn't stop shearing my sheep and spinning and knitting their wool, could I? And the apples had to be picked, didn't they? I couldn't waste them, could I? So I made Aunt Mabel's apple jelly. It never fails to set, and it looks so pretty, doesn't it?" She smiled up at the rows and rows of ruby jars glowing on the shelf. "As for the cheese, McElliot is such a heavy milker, she just thrives on adventures, but it's time she was home now. Mrs. Dumpling started to look anxious. I hope the trolls haven't gotten her. She's such a ninny-nanny of a goat. Not a chance, Captain Duff said stoutly. I never met a goat with more sense in all my travels. Did you, McGruer? McGruer waved a tentacle in agreement. And a goat with such good taste. I mean, where would she find anything more to her liking than on my clothesline? Mrs. Dumpling laughed her rich, rumbling laugh. You're right. McElliot is not stupid. She's more than a match for all the trolls of Otago. It's my guess she'll be home to help polish off that apple dumpling as soon as McGruer gets it out of the chimney tomorrow, Captain Duff said with great certainty. But she was not. McGruer did a splendid job of cleaning out the chimney, and there was more than enough apple dumpling for 2 serves each. McGruer put aside a fair share for McElliot, but only the bees came to taste it. Mrs. Dumpling was full of praise for McGruer's efforts. I don't believe my chimney has been more thoroughly cleaned since your father did it, she said to Captain Duff. There never was a better chimney sweep. We've certainly missed him in the district since he died. If Mr. McGruer would like to carry on the family business, I'm sure folk would be very pleased. There must be a lot of chimneys overdue for a good sweep. Captain Duff thought of all the stories he would hear sitting in kitchens waiting for McGruer. He was a glutton for stories. What do you think? He asked the octopus. McGruer winked and went black. A wink is as good as a nod, Captain Duff said. Let's go look in the ceiling where my dad always kept his brushes. Sure enough, the brushes were there. McGruer passed them down to Captain Duff, who demonstrated. Like this, McGruer. McGruer tried them out in Captain Duff's chimney. They went across to tell Mrs. Dumpling. There was the smell of apple pies coming from her kitchen. Won't you stay to lunch? I'm worried about McElliot, she said, all in one breath. So they stayed, and Captain Duff told some of his tales to keep her mind off what might have happened to McElliot. McGruer was full of apple dumpling, so he could manage only one apple pie, even though it was the most delicious he had ever tasted, with pastry that melted in the mouth and apples drooling with cinnamon and sugar. Captain Duff was so busy telling tales because he was hungry for a listener that he ate only one also, even though it was better than those his mother used to make. Mrs. Dumpling was so busy listening because she was starved for stories of the wide, wide world that she only ate one also, even though they were the best batch she had ever made, thanks to McGruer cleaning the chimney so well. So there were 33 apple pies left on the table. What shall I do with them if McElliot doesn't come home? Mrs. Dumpling wailed. Captain Duff filled her teacup and said, Well now, if you were in Bombay, I would say go to the bazaar. And Mrs. Dumpling forgot to worry as she began to listen again. McGruer stole away from the table. He went to Mrs. Dumpling's shed and found the cart McElliot had refused to pull. He dragged it out into the autumn sunshine and brushed the dust off, then quickly took it down to her door. Captain Duff was telling about Shanghai now, and Mrs. Dumpling had forgotten her teacup. She had dropped her knitting and her eyes were bulging like crabapple dumplings. You don't say, Captain Duff. Go on. Stealthily, silently, McGruer slipped in and lifted down piles of socks, packed them into the bottom of the cart, gently put a layer of apple pies on top, lovingly covered them with a layer of gloves until with layer after layer the cart was almost full and the table was empty. He had just lifted down 24 jars of apple jelly to pack into the corners when the flash of ruby caught Mrs. Dumpling's eye. She shrieked, Oh, Mr. McGruer, what a fright you gave me! Careful of my jars, they'll break on this stone floor. Captain Duff chuckled. McGruer's not McElliot. He won't drop them. McGruer stretched out 2 tentacles proudly and displayed 12 jars of apple jelly firmly fixed to each. He's like those waiters in Marseille I was telling you about, Captain Duff said, the ones who can carry 12 plates up their arms at a time. Well, I never, was all Mrs. Dumpling could say. She watched McGruer pack the precious jars, then hitch himself to the shafts. You've certainly got yourself a smart octopus, and no mistake. He's got me more like it, Captain Duff said, patting McGruer, who gave him a friendly squeeze. There he is, holding all the jars. When I think of the trouble I used to have trying to harness up McElliot, it was a proper circus. Talking of circuses, Captain Duff said, have you ever seen a Russian bear? Now, when I was in Vladivostok, McGruer winked at Mrs. Dumpling. She put fresh tea in the pot. McGruer sidled into a corner and began fiddling with the spinning wheel. Captain Duff went on talking. Mrs. Dumpling took up her knitting again and McGruer began to spin. Just look at that, Mrs. Dumpling marvelled. Captain Duff said, he's like me. He likes a good yarn, and he and Mrs. Dumpling laughed so loudly that the sound of it went over the hills and far away. McElliot heard it and wondered what fun she was missing. She started to head for home. But she still hadn't arrived by next morning. Mrs. Dumpling hung the bucket and milking stool on hooks at the back of the cart. You never know, she said. You're right, Captain Duff said cheerfully, shouldering the chimney brushes while McGruer hitched himself into the cart again. That's the best part of setting sail. Anything could happen. Anchors away, he called. Mrs. Dumpling was a little nervous of saying, hold hard, my hearty, to an octopus, so she said, just a moment, please, Mr. McGruer, leaned over to him and popped a cap she had been knitting onto his head. To keep the soot out of your eyes, she said. McGruer turned bright pink. It was the first time anyone had given him a present. He took off.